At first, there was nothing, and then there was satire. But what is satire, and why on earth do we love it so much? Satire is a genre of literature, and sometimes graphic and performing arts, in which the vices, follies, abuses, and shortcomings of society are held up to ridicule, ideally with the intent of shaming individuals, corporations, government, or society itself into improvement. Although satire is usually meant to be humorous, its greater purpose is to act as a conduit of social criticism, using wit to draw attention to both particular and wider issues in society. The earliest known recording of satire is dated all the way back to 2000 BCE and was found in ancient Egypt. In 400 BCE, the Greeks had no formal word for what we call satire, but Greek playwrights such as Aristophanes were some of the earliest known satirists. It wasn't until 500 years later, in 100 CE, at the height of the Roman Empire, that we finally have the word we use today, satire. It originates from the Latin word satira, which means poetic medley, and was first used by the Romans. But it wasn't until the year 800 AD, in medieval Islam, that the word satire and the word comedy became synonymous with each other. It wasn't until the 1500s that satire became more of a common practice, in the form of poetry, and thus the true connection between satire and writing began, as most satire was in the form of drawings or paintings before this time. However, much of the satire at this time was heavily criticized by the church as being un-Christian, as it often took stabs at the institution of both the church and the feudal society. Thomas More's Utopia and some of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are examples of satirical works during the Resistance. In the 1600s, during the Elizabethan era, satire was believed to be rude, and writers usually contained more straightforward abuse than subtle irony in their writings. Satire was used to degrade officials and corrupt nobles until it was eventually censored. Satire wasn't used to this extent again until the Age of Enlightenment, which produced a great revival of satire in Europe. One amazing example of this crude Elizabethan satire was Jonathan Swift, who, in his journal A Modest Proposal, suggests that the Irish peasants should sell their own children as food to the rich as a solution to the problem of poverty. Cut to the 17th century and you have great works of satire. Mark Twain, a great American satirist, and his novel Huckleberry Finn, which cleverly pokes fun at the strict moral values being deftly portrayed by most of the literature at that time. In the 18th century, you have novelists such as Charles Dickens, who often use passages of satiric writing in their treatment of social issues. However, perhaps the most enduring example of satire in the Victorian era would be the Savoy operas. Savoy opera was a style of comedic opera that developed in Victorian England in the late 19th century, and it was the perfect platform for all of the greatest satirical work to take place. Moving forward in time, we are beginning to reach the golden era of political satire. In the 19th century, you have authors such as Huxley and Orwell, who make serious and frightening commentaries on the dangers of sweeping social changes taking place throughout Europe and the United States, including the spread of communism. Famous satirical works from this time include Animal Farm, Dr. Strangelove, Catch-22, Beyond the Fringe, and many more. And finally, we reach the 2000s. But most modern satire is incorrectly labeled as such. While satire may contain devices such as caricatures or parody, these and other humorous devices are not necessarily satiric. Just as there are now a wide array of different types of media, satire itself has adapted to fit all of those new forms. But it is arguably television where we get the bulk of our satire, with programs such as The Colbert Report, South Park, or even Saturday Night Live. By going back and taking a look at the history of satire, it is clear to see why, as long as mankind has had some form of the written word, there have been different forms of satire to go along with it. As long as humans do what they do best in terms of struggling for power, oppressing others, or fighting for what is equal, there is always going to be satire. Satire is what makes us question the world around us, but by doing so in a comedic way, it is arguably more effective than some of the other forms of speaking against social injustices. When we think of satire as it stands today, just because we don't normally think of the mediums that we now find most satire to be a form of writing, doesn't mean that writing doesn't take place behind the scenes, or that its purpose, relevancy, or message behind that satire has diminished in any way. In this current political climate, at least in the United States, satire is being used more and more to express discontentment. It is important to understand where the practice of satire came from, so that way we can better understand what it means for us as a society when it is arguably overly present. The comedic canary in the coal mine, if you will. It is also important to understand the roots of satire, so that way we can become better at identifying it. Hate speech is a huge issue, and a lot of the time, those who spout it use satire as a cover. On the other side of that coin, those who preach that satire itself is hate speech do so because they do not understand what satire is trying to do. This is another thing that satire accomplishes. By identifying those who do not find satire funny, it then exposes the extreme believers on both sides, showing that if they are unable to take the joke, that their beliefs are usually extreme and deep-rooted.